Professor Jiang is not wrong that America can get trapped in an Iran war. What he gets wrong is the scale of the trap. He takes a real danger, stretches it into a dramatic narrative, and then treats that narrative like the most likely outcome. But if you look at this through physics, evolutionary psychology, system dynamics, and game theory, the real story is different. The most likely path is not total American collapse, it is strategic compression, a stronger power being forced to settle for a smaller outcome than it originally imagined. Professor Jiang's conclusion on the US-Iran war is powerful, dramatic, and emotionally persuasive. That is exactly why it spread so fast. He is telling people what they already fear, that America will overreach, get dragged into a trap, and end up losing in the Middle East again. And to be fair, that risk is real. America can absolutely win tactically and still lose strategically. That part is not fantasy. But the problem is this. Professor Jiang does not just describe a risk, he overstates that risk and starts treating a tail scenario like the baseline path. That is where the analysis becomes biased. Let's start with physics. In any real system, power is not just about maximum force, it is about force under constraints. A country is not a movie villain with infinite energy, it is a bounded system. It has military capacity, yes, but it also has political limits, economic limits, alliance limits, and social limits. So the real question is not, can America hit Iran hard? Of course it can. The real question is whether America can keep expanding its war aims without triggering stronger and stronger constraints inside its own system. And that is exactly where Professor Jiang goes too far. He talks as if America is likely to continue escalating until it walks into a historical disaster. But real systems under high cost do not usually move in straight lines toward maximum catastrophe. They usually start searching for a new balance point. That is the first thing he underestimates: equilibrium-seeking behavior. When costs rise fast enough, systems adapt. They shrink goals, they change language, they redefine victory. They stop saying, "We will transform the region," and start saying, "We have achieved our core objectives." That is not a detail, that is the whole structure. Strong powers do not always lose because the enemy beats them on the battlefield. Sometimes they lose because their own system forces them to settle for less than what they originally imagined. That is a very different kind of loss from the one Professor Jiang dramatizes. Now look at this through evolutionary psychology. States under threat do not behave like calm philosophers. They behave like organisms under pressure. They become more loss-averse, more status-sensitive, more obsessed with survival, humiliation, credibility, and internal cohesion. Iran's behavior makes sense under this framework. Iran does not need to defeat America in a symmetrical war. It does not need air superiority or global reach. It only needs to preserve regime survival, maintain some retaliation capacity, and make the cost of escalation high enough that America starts looking for an exit. That is a much simpler objective, and simpler objectives are often more durable in conflict. This is where Professor Jiang is partly right. He understands that the weaker side can still shape the outcome if its survival function is narrow and intense enough, but he still pushes too far, because he tends to imply that once America enters the trap, the logic of escalation becomes almost inevitable. That is the exaggeration. Evolutionary psychology cuts both ways. America is also a threat-sensitive system. As costs rise, it does not just become more aggressive, it also becomes more defensive, more risk-aware, and more internally divided over what the war is actually worth. In other words, pressure does not only produce escalation, it also produces self-correction. Now bring in system dynamics. This is the deepest layer. War is not a straight line, it is a feedback system. America hits Iran harder. Iran responds not by matching total force, but by shifting the battlefield. It pushes pressure into oil, shipping, regional fear, market volatility, and alliance stress. That, in turn, creates pressure back inside the US system through inflation, politics, consumer stress, market weakness, and strategic fatigue. That then changes the American decision-making environment. So the real battlefield is not just missiles and bombers, it is the feedback loop between military action and systemic cost. Professor Jiang sees the trap, but he narrates the trap too dramatically. He makes it sound like America is likely to fall into an unstoppable spiral. But in most complex systems, the first feedback loop does not produce infinite escalation, it produces compression. Goals narrow, time horizons shorten, messaging changes. The political class starts looking for a way to claim success without paying for total victory. That is the more likely path, not because America is wise, not because Iran is weak, but because system pressure changes incentives before the most extreme scenario fully unfolds. This leads directly into game theory. The US-Iran war is not a game where one side needs total victory and the other side needs total surrender. That is not how these contests work. Iran's payoff structure is narrow: survive, retaliate enough to raise cost, avoid political collapse, preserve future leverage. America's payoff structure is much wider and more unstable: deter Iran, protect shipping, reassure allies, avoid oil shock, avoid inflation, avoid looking weak, avoid getting trapped, avoid long occupation, avoid domestic backlash. Once one side has a narrow payoff and the other side has a broad payoff, the stronger side often becomes less strategically stable. Why? Because the stronger side has more things to protect and more ways to feel that the current path is becoming too expensive. This is the central point Professor Jiang underestimates. He underestimates America's ability to change its own objective function. He treats America enters the war as if that automatically means America marches toward the most extreme version of the war. But those are not the same thing. In reality, states constantly redefine objectives under pressure, and once that starts happening, the war does not have to end in dramatic defeat. It can end in strategic reduction. America may still damage Iran severely. It may still claim a military success. It may still preserve part of its deterrent image. But it may quietly abandon larger ambitions and settle for a much smaller political outcome. That is why I think Professor Jiang is not wrong about danger. He is wrong about the default path. He sees a real tail risk, but mistakes it for the main road. The most likely outcome is not that America collapses into some giant imperial catastrophe in the Middle East. The more likely outcome is that America discovers the price of full victory is too high and starts moving towards a smaller and more politically manageable definition of success. That is still a trap in a sense, but it is not the kind of trap he dramatizes. It is not a cinematic collapse. It is a structural narrowing. And once you see that, the whole debate changes. The real issue is not whether America can destroy Iranian targets. It can. The real issue is whether America can convert military superiority into a stable political end state before rising costs force it to shrink its aims. That is the question. Not battlefield dominance, but political conversion under constraint. Not raw power, but power filtered through feedback loops. Not emotion, but systemic balance. So my conclusion is simple. Professor Jiang is right that America can walk into danger with Iran. He is right that military superiority does not guarantee strategic success. He is right that weaker states can survive by making stronger states pay too much. But he overstates the path from danger to disaster. He underestimates self-correction, equilibrium-seeking behavior, and the way powerful systems redefine victory under rising pressure. In short, he is not wrong about the risk. He is wrong about the likely shape of the outcome. The most likely ending is not total American defeat. It is strategic compression. A stronger power enters the conflict with broad ambitions, rising rhetoric, and visible force. Then costs spread, feedback loops intensify, domestic and external constraints rise, and in the end, the stronger power settles for a smaller victory than the one it originally imagined. That is the real logic here. Not dramatic collapse, but forced reduction. Not the end of power, but the shrinking of its political objective.